Hey guys, we are Nerds by Nature. I'm your host, Braden. I'm joined here by my co-host, Seth and Brian. So, Brian, what is our topic for today?
So today we are talking about the creation and the legacy of the Star Wars original trilogy, which is basically the first blockbuster that ever came out. So it made so much money that they had to make a new term for it, blockbuster.
Right. Awesome. So, as we were kind of discussing this topic and how we were going to approach it, I was really surprised by how big of an icon Star Wars has become and how things have taken off from just one simple movie. And so how did it make so much money? Like what even is this phenomenon that is Star Wars?
Well, I think one of the things, some reference material for everyone who's about to listen to this podcast. Empire of Dreams goes into this a whole bunch.
Oh, yeah.
But one of the things was just the timing of the story. It was a very well-told hero's journey story in a time where hero's journey stories were kind of starting to fade a bit, but also a tumultuous time. Like, this was the time of the Vietnam War, where people kind of wanted that kind of story. And George Lucas just did it really well. So on the story side, I think that's part of why it succeeded.
And I'd say on top of that, it's taking that hero's journey and bringing it into a new genre that hadn't really seen that. When we think of sci-fi nowadays, it's very, very, hero's journey or just more character focused. But we'll get into it a bit later. But the sci-fi genre before Star Wars was basically, let's look at this cool idea. And that was kind of it. So it was a very big shift in what sci-fi was and what kind of story that sci-fi authors and writers were trying to tell.
Yeah, this is in Star Wars was a completely different approach to sci-fi. It wasn't even that much of sci-fi because, like you said, all of these things of being sci-fi were all of these brain type books or movies or content that was to make you think and think things about the future and all of these things. But Star Wars is not per se a sci-fi. It is sci-fi based, as in like its elements are not absolutely realistic, I guess, but it is definitely not. It's more of a, what do they call it? It's more of a space opera is the term coined for this.
Yeah, another term that's kind of coined is called soft sci-fi, where hard sci-fi is really focused on if this thing could really happen, what would the consequences be, etc. And the technology, there's usually how it works is very much part of the story. Whereas in Star Wars, it's more of a soft sci-fi where the technology just exists. It's a thing that's part of the world, but they don't explain how it works, why it works. It's not really central to the story. And before Star Wars, one of the big sci-fi writers was Asimov, and he was very much, if you look at things like I, Robot and such, he was very into the philosophical, if this technology existed, what would the moral consequences be? Whereas Star Wars was just a hero's journey story within a sci-fi world.
Yeah, so leading up into the pre-Star Wars era of what all the content was, where this even came from, George Lucas in Empire of Dreams described as being inspired by things like Flash Gordon, which was kind of this action-packed sci-fi cartoonish film thing.
Yeah.
That was his big source of what he wanted to have his film be portrayed as. But a lot of the big things into this sci-fi was, as you said, Foundation from Asimov, iRobot. And all of this was produced 20-ish years ahead of this time, kind of preparing this way for Star Wars to be made.
It should be noted, though, that sci-fi wasn't very popular before Star Wars.
Not really, no.
He had one of the things that gets covered in Empire of Dreams also a lot is George really had to fight to not get his movie shut down by Fox because sci-fi films were known for just not making any money. Yes, and so George Lucas had a very low budget, and even the budget he did have, they were constantly being like, is this even going to make enough to justify this budget? And it turned around and made so much money they have to double that. Stock prices literally doubled, but
Like the biggest movie since then was 2001. And like the first time 2001 came out, they didn't make any of their money back.
Yeah.
And so they were like, well, we'll just release it again. And that's where they got everything. And that's where it started getting big. And so that was a big segue into what made Star Wars even possible to produce.
Yeah.
Well, wasn't the space age also during that time period also of like?
Oh yeah, the space race was. I mean, it had ended by 1977, but like it would have been all when George Lucas was growing up because I mean, 50s and 60s were when it was really a big thing. Basically, for those who don't know history of it, space race was when the U.S. and the Soviet Union were basically just racing to flex how far they could get into space.
Yep.
Well, it was a big fear. Like that was everybody's like. It was a big fear of the Soviets were going to be bombing us from space and stuff.
Yeah. Which
hasn't happened yet. So.
It has not happened yet. In fact, there's actually a bunch of reasons why it's actually less efficient to bomb from space than what we have now. But that's completely side note.
Yeah.
But yeah, the space age, it happened kind of right nestled into that age of sci-fi being more of that exploration of ideas and other things. We already mentioned Flash Gordon. We mentioned Asimov with both his Foundation series and his iRobot series, which again were very philosophical. What are the impacts of these things? And then right around that time after as well, just like a few years after, another sci-fi classic that came out before Star Wars is Dune.
That's right.
The book came out before Star Wars, yeah.
Yeah. 65.
Yeah. Dune by Frank Herbert is another big sci-fi classic, and we're starting to see it kind of resurge with the movies that are coming out. But it was kind of similar-ish in its like impact on the sci-fi
it was
scape, I'd say.
Also a soft sci-fi, and it also had fantasy elements like Star Wars did. It didn't follow the hero's journey quite as much. It's more of like a prelude to...
Spoiler alert for the next 20 seconds after the beep.
This is a little spoilery, so shut your ears, listeners, if you have to, but it's a prelude to a galactic genocide.
Yep, prelude to a villain.
Interesting.
Paul Atreides is not a good guy in the rest of the series. He's kind of cool in the first few books, in the first book, and then he kind of sucks after that. But what matters about Dune is that it's kind of one of the sci-fi classics where, along with Asimov, Frank Herbert is considered to be one of the fathers of sci-fi, at least modern sci-fi.
Yeah.
Where while it didn't focus on the hero's journey, it was still a bit more philosophical, considering it was, a very big political book where it all surrounded, this very limited natural resource and the planet and exploitation and stuff like that. But it still wasn't that hero's journey, though it did kind of mark a change in that sci-fi scape, and it was more story focused instead of philosophical focused.
And you can see some of the impacts it had. I mean, Tatooine is also a desert planet. That's a really big thing in Dune. The Bene Gesserit are very similar to the Jedi in a lot of the base ways and have some big differences. But, and then just that teenage boy being the main protagonist. Obviously, Luke Skywalker takes a very different approach where he is more hero's journey, but there's still kind of that influence there.
Yeah, I found it really interesting. How George mentioned how he spent so much time in like Greek mythology and just ancient mythology and trying to figure out why those stories stuck around for so long. And he narrowed it down to, once again, as we were discussing, the hero's journey. And so he he found the essence of storytelling, and pretty much everything's either a riff on the tropes of a hero's journey or on different elements of that make things into these iconic classics of what the stories that people really enjoy are all based off of these concepts. And so I found it really interesting how much research that George actually did before producing a movie like this.
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember his name right now, but the guy who came up with the whole theory of the hero's journey, kind of looking back into history and realizing, oh, there's kind of a pattern here. I can't remember his name right now, but he said his best student ever was George Lucas. And obviously, he never taught George Lucas in college or anything, but he could see the influences there.
Yeah, George did not come out of, obviously, after doing all that research, he wasn't like this noob or anything, or not this person that's just like, oh, I'm going to make this movie and it's going to be awesome. We'll just walk up to Fox and be like, hey, this is my movie.
Yeah.
He had produced a couple of movies before. Like one of the big ones was American Graffiti, which everybody was super nervous about that movie. And it took a while. And in the end, George wasn't really happy with that movie. I don't know if you heard about that, because like directors and stuff, all the executives got on it and cut things out and put things in. And he was really frustrated with that. And this is what really inspired him to, he's like, all right, I'm going to start my own company, going to start my own production, and I'm going to do this.
George was very big and is very big about not having executives involved as much as possible. I mean, to the point where now that he's sold Star Wars and has his $4 billion, he makes movies still. He just doesn't release them. He makes movies outside of movie studios for fun these days. That's what he does.
So jumping into kind of, let's jump into characters a little bit. I'm really intrigued into that. Brian, you were saying how obviously Luke is kind of the focus of the story, and this is your hero's journey. And why do you think it's so important to have a character like this? It's a young boy.
I think one of Luke's character traits is just his thirst for something beyond a farm life. He wants something more out of his life, and he wants adventure. And I think that's something we all want to some degree. I mean, not all of us necessarily want to go fight a galactic civil war, but we all want something that's not boring in our lives.
Right.
And there was that hero's journey. And there's also just the maturing of Luke throughout the series. He starts out kind of whiny a little bit, a little immature. And then he goes through these adventures and encounters the real world, where he finds out, oh, my father isn't actually real. I mean, he was a Jedi, but he's actually kind of evil now. And he kind of has to face that dilemma. And he has to mature to the point where he's like, okay, I like adventure and all that, and that's still a value. But he also has to face the real world and redeem his father. And it's just a really well done arc that it's hero's journey, but it also twists a little bit some of the hero's journey stuff on its head with the whole Darth Vader twist in a way that I think was really good for the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think just thinking about Luke, and I think characters in general throughout Star Wars is something that, I mean, that's what we were talking about, just how captivating it is. And I think it has a lot to do with the shift from what sci-fi used to be and what sci-fi or just storytelling is now.
Yeah.
Where Luke, as Brian was talking about, is this super compelling character.
Relatable.
Yeah. And even if, maybe Darth Vader isn't relatable, or Obi-Wan isn't, relatable, they're very compelling characters, and they're interesting, and you're able to care about them. Whereas maybe in, previous sci-fi stories, like Asimov's stuff or other things that were very philosophical, they didn't really care about characters.
Yeah.
It was all about, again, the ideas. So now we have this story where it's all about this farm boy who wants more, like Brian said. And it's simply set in space, which is cool.
We went from a very serious tone sci-fi where you'd almost read sci-fi as like a prediction of the future and potential problems. It's almost like a doom and gloom sometimes.
Yeah.
to this very fun film that still has its dark moments, but just it's a very fun, adventurous film. I mean, George has said, like, he wanted 12-year-olds to be able to enjoy it, and they certainly do, even to this day.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, that's all our childhoods. Like, that just proves how much that's true. Like, I've loved Star Wars for basically my entire life.
yeah.
Just
Before I even
because-
watched the films, like, I watched the films when I was 9, because when my parents would let me, but I knew, like, half the plot of Star Wars before then.
Yeah.
Right. And I found it so interesting, like going into just briefly like Obi-Wan and of him being he's your basic, your mentor character, teaching him Luke in the ways of the Force, bringing him into like greater knowledge of just how the galaxy works a little bit more. Then you have your gunslinger type guy of Han Solo. And then the really interesting trope for me that Lucas just threw out the door, or just to put the trope right on its head, was the damsel in distress. Because of this hero's journey, there's all of these 4 key concept characters, but Leia is not a character as such of, oh, I'm in this trouble and I need your help. I'm going to be the one that's...
She's much more
useless.
independent than the damsel in a lot of mythology previously.
And I loved in Empire of Dreams how they paid so much attention and on how George picked these actors, not just the character, because obviously the character was crafted beforehand, but picking the actor to fit what you've already crafted was something that I don't think that is implemented as much in today's modern film and filmmaking.
Modern Hollywood needs to learn that Chris Pratt does not, in fact, need to be in everything.
No, why is Chris Pratt Mario? Like, that doesn't make any sense. But it was everything was intentional. Luke was chosen after, like, George Lucas took 4 months of consistent casting to be able to find these people.
Empire of Dreams has some of the tapes from both the actors that got the job, but some of them that didn't. And just looking at the differences, it's definitely cool how, like, he actually had the judgment to, like, keep going. Because some of those tapes, they weren't, like, bad acting, but they just weren't Luke, Leia, or Han to me. And maybe that's hindsight bias, but...
True, yeah. It's just not the same character. And so Mark Hamill being chosen for Luke, Carrie Fisher being chosen for Leia, and the funniest thing to me is Harrison Ford was just somebody that George Lucas knew, and he didn't want to have somebody that was big out and a popular actor.
But Harrison Ford had worked with him for American Graffiti, right?
That's correct.
That's how we knew him.
And so he knew him, and he was there as a stand-in to give actors lines and just give him tips on to play these characters. And then in the end, George was like, well, he just plays the guy so well. Like, you're him.
And now Harrison Ford can't get away from it.
Yeah.
He couldn't get away from it in the beginning, and he can't now.
Yeah. And so it shows me more and more as you get into this research of how intentional things were. It was not a cash grab for him. This was a passion project.
Yes.
I was about to bring up. I think one of the biggest underlying reasons it succeeded was because it was a passion project, and he was willing to put in the work to champion the story, even though Fox didn't want it really produced at all. I think surprised they ever agreed to it with how ornery they were throughout its whole production.
Yeah.
He was willing to go through the long casting process. He was willing to push for technological development that was needed with the modeling and some of the special effects.
Yeah.
He's willing to sit in a hot desert because that's where the Tatooine scenes were filmed in Tunisia, and pretty much everyone was miserable there.
Yeah.
And he was willing to go through a very stressful editing process. He was actually hospitalized because they thought he might have a heart attack, and it was probably due to stress was why he was at that point.
Yep.
Yeah. I want to jump into he had to create his own company to make all of the special effects that he was producing.
Yep.
Industrial Light and Magic is such a big icon for producing excellent, not just CGI, but excellent visual effects, period, in today's age. And I find it so interesting that, like you said, of he knew what he wanted, and he had to push the technology up to the point, because film and like Hollywood, it was taboo to think that anything could go digital of filmmaking. It kept to your actual physical film of things, and they had purposely stopped any type of production to move that forward. And now this is the only way that things are produced. Film does not exist.
And to be fair,
at all.
A lot of the original trilogy wasn't digital at first.
No, it wasn't. But the whole concept of that.
The concept was definitely developed by Industrial Light and Magic.
Another thing,
particularly during the 90s, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, exactly. Another thing was all of the motorized camera mechanics for all of like the ship's scenes and stuff like that. Yeah. So they could splice things together a lot easier because the camera was moving in the exact same way every single time. And so you didn't have to have a camera guy trying to move things to the right exact point without jittering or whatever. Yeah. It was robotic, if in another sense of the word, of moving that camera into precise positions so that those models that they had filmed behind a blue screen would look perfectly with the other things that they had filmed, because they couldn't do it all at the same time. Yeah. And so everything spliced together perfectly. And so this was not something
amazing. Easy. It's amazing how well this movie's special effects, like you can tell it's made in the 70s, sure.
Yeah.
But compared to some of the other films you see in the 70s and other sci-fi films you've seen of the same era, this movie holds up astonishingly well.
Yeah, watch any movie before then and you'll be floored at like how cringy some things were here. And it's the only thing closest to it was like what? 2001, because you've seen 2001. What's the comparison?
Oh, 2001, I will say, is gorgeous. It is a beautiful movie. But again, that is mostly because it came from Stanley Kubrick, another just legendary director. And so, I mean, I'm sure Lucas took some inspiration.
Oh yeah.
But it's just a beautiful movie. The difference is maybe though, I just love thinking about that Star Wars is such a, it broke so many bounds. It like changed the industry so much under a tiny budget. Like that is just amazing.
Yeah. The budget, in current US, adjusted for inflation, I think it was like $8.5 million at the time, but adjusted for current inflation, I think it was $37 million, which is very low for a movie, and particularly low for a sci-fi movie that's like inventing things as it goes.
Like an episode of the current Kenobi show was like 20.
Yeah,
and so one episode. You're producing an entire movie with.
And that Kenobi did not push any bounds in terms of CGI.
No. And so the money you put into stuff is not exactly the direct output of the quality of content.
Actually probably the biggest lesson right there, what Braden just said. Hollywood, learn that lesson, please.
Yeah, I think it's a testament to what passion and love for a project can do. We're going to go into it later, as in like in another episode.
Yeah.
But there's just such a difference between today's Star Wars and what Star Wars used to be. Where now that Star Wars is owned by Disney, it's a money grab. And they just throw money at it and hope it works, and it doesn't. But then you have Lucas back in, the 70s. And it was instead a work of love. Something that he just wanted to do, him and his team wanted to do. And so they just poured their hearts and souls into it. And even though the budget was tiny, because there was that passion behind it, it worked.
But, I mean, kind of a testament to this, without complaining more about the sequel trilogy, because that's been complained about enough in modern times, is the fact that there were sequels made to the original New Hope. There was Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. Lucas didn't stop. I mean, Lucas had made enough money at that point that he could have just stopped. Like, he'd made it. You're done. Don't have to work for the rest of your life. But instead, he reinvested that money back into making Empire Strikes Back.
Every penny
Because
of it
he-
almost.
Yeah, because he wanted this. He loved this story and he wanted to see it on screen, the whole thing, because it was actually originally written as one movie, the original trilogy, and he split it into 3 parts because he's like, this is kind of long.
Nice impression.
We're all grateful for that.
That wasn't actually an on-purpose impression, but it
was
did
good.
kind of work.
It was a good impression. I just, I don't know. I'm always baffled of like getting a sequel to produce as well or hundreds of times better than your original is difficult. And
Very.
we've seen this over and over and over.
I mean,
and
part of
over.
it was the fact that the sequel was planned from the beginning.
True. That is very
But
true.
sequels are definitely a death sentence to franchises a lot of the times.
Yeah.
Like, once you run out of however much story you originally planned to tell, if you're making a sequel, you're probably going to kill your franchise.
Yeah.
Which, unfortunately, happened to Star Wars, too, but no more complaining
But
about
once
that.
again, that sequel wasn't a money grab. This was a, hey,
Oh, yeah.
I want to take this another step further
Yeah.
and produce it for you guys, or produce it
Yeah.
because I want to see this on a screen.
And one of the great things about Empire, I think, was the fact that it was now completely free of executive control because George invested that money.
He wasn't constantly
was-
stressed.
Yeah, I mean, he was able to step back a little bit, and Irvin Kershner did a great job of taking over directing, and yeah, just makes me. I wonder if studios would have let that "I am your father" slip through
Yeah.
if it weren't for him being able to reinvest, like, because it was a risky twist, like the villain being the main character's father. It was kind of a risky twist.
That was a really risky, like thinking
Very
about
well
it,
executed, but
because like
kind of
that,
a risky twist.
that makes you doubt everything going forward of, oh great, now this hero's journey, this guy he's done, he's now going to turn into a bad guy, kind of breaking this, holding to a destiny is what a lot of things hold to.
It threw the whole, one of the cool things, I watched a whole video essay about this, is like one of the cool things about that twist is it takes the whole fate, you're destined to succeed trope and turns it on its head. He thought he was destined to become like his father, but he thought that meant success.
Right.
Suddenly now that means I'm going to be in a mechanical suit as an evil dude. And that's why Return of the Jedi is such a climax, because it's like, what actually is his destiny?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it ends really well
Yeah.
for everyone involved.
Yeah, it really is. Okay, let's shift into Return of the Jedi, which is like, I love that movie just as much as any of them. But how do you take an ending like that of Luke, I am your father, and putting that into wow, I even said the quote wrong. I feel so ashamed. But putting
I am your father.
I am your father, and putting that straight into a whole nother movie. How do you get that transition of, okay, you have your gunslinger guy, he's quote unquote gone, and then all you have is this new guy that you developed in the middle of the story,
Yeah.
the guy that's now the bad guy's son, and a bunch of robots. What do
Well,
you do with that?
It's done with great difficulty, but I would say it was done amazingly. I think just talking about that transition a bit, I really do love the dynamic that you have between Luke and Darth Vader in the 6th movie. There isn't much communication, but you kind of see throughout the entire movie both of them having an internal battle where
That's very true.
There's a reason Luke's costume is black the whole movie, and that only when he has successfully redeemed Vader does that. There's a little part of his costume that turns down and it's white. It's a nice costume effect.
I have never thought of
have
it
I.
from that perspective, but that is awesome.
that's really cool.
Yeah. And it's also amazing to me how well Return of the Jedi connects into the prequels. Like, when you look at we'll talk about the prequels in
Go
another
ahead.
episode,
Go
but
ahead.
when you look at the moments of Anakin's fall and the moments of his redemption, they're very similar.
Yeah,
Just, it's a very symmetrical storytelling, as George would put it.
very
Yeah.
nice.
Yeah, it's such an interesting perspective of that. I just love that redemption, that final putting things all together. It's the end of the trilogy. He
Yeah.
knew that this was going to be it, and
Mhm.
how it takes of continuing that hero's journey of it's an actual resolution of an actual arc of as you were saying, even down to the change of costume of he had the potential to fall in. He was offered multiple times to fall in and become the most powerful being and overthrow the emperor alongside his father, which is like, what else do you want? Like, he wanted adventure. He wanted all of this stuff. He wanted to be great.
I think one of the great things about that arc is that Luke doesn't win because he's the best Jedi, strongest Jedi ever. He's not the best with a lightsaber. I mean, he's really strong, but he's not the best with a lightsaber.
Twice.
He's not, he doesn't win because he's physically the strongest, which is how a lot of heroes' journeys had ended to that point in a lot of Greek mythology. But Luke wins because of the opposite of, well, not the opposite of that, but because, to use a Hercules quote, because of the strength of his heart. He is willing to throw aside his lightsaber and completely believe in his father. I think that's just such a cool way to end that arc, and to really not necessarily subvert the hero's journey trope, but show what it's really about.
Yeah. And I think also just with that, talking about that whole ending where, Vader does, turn to his son's side. That's also kind of just a subversion of, what had been seen in the past, right?
Yeah.
Because up to that point, it was always just the irredeemable villains, right? Where they're just bad and that's it. But now you have Vader who's bad, but then you see his inner turmoil in episode 6 that finally culminates in him helping his son, who he'd kind of been against the entire movie. And so it's just such a cool subversion and such, at least for the time, a new idea that is now, done.
Yeah.
A ton, because it's just such an amazing trope.
It was very well done how you went from this villain who the first shot of him is he's walking in, he's in full black, full helmet. He has that breathing sound that just makes you go, oh, I'm about to die. Right? And then you go from that to, he's still in costume the whole time up until the very end, and you still feel for him. And it was just such good acting. Such good writing.
Yeah.
I'm surprised how much emotion you can put behind a mask. I guess this leads a little bit into like Mandalorian and stuff like that, of how much emotion you can put into a character, even though you can't see their face, and you can see the inner turmoil and kind of like feel and hear their thoughts. Of that scene when Luke is being electrified. And just absolutely electrocuted and being just absolutely just decimated by You're like, oh well, this is how the movie ends. Nice, well, game over. Dust off your hands. Just looking back and forth, I just remember that scene of, as you were describing, of just looking between the Emperor of this, the guy that he's been following and taking orders from for the last, it's been
20-some years at this point.
Years.
Yeah.
And then taking his son's side of he doesn't know him. He didn't know he really existed.
Yeah.
Things like that, which is, I guess that's retroactive lore. But even then you could feel that of, like you said, that inner turmoil of taking his son's side and being like, well, let me just throw this down the hole and we'll have our problem solved. So, it's absolutely masterful. This Star Wars, the originals episode series, and how much care, as we've discussed multiple times, was put into this, and how everything was very intentional,
very well planned. There's always a joke about the incest.
Yeah.
But I dare you to name one other thing that wasn't planned about that trilogy. And there was very few you can really name that feel beyond the accidental kiss.
Yeah.
There's very little you can name that didn't feel planned.
Right. So, awesome. Well, any other final comments, thoughts on what we've discussed so far?
I guess maybe just to bring it together, kind of just touching on the points that we've generally talked about throughout this episode. Why Star Wars was such a groundbreaking series and why it has just impacted
generations at this point.
Generations, and impacted genres, impacted just movies, Hollywood in general. It's just such a big piece of history. Is first, it was a subversion of genre where it was very different from sci-fi before. And adding on to that, we had the hero's journey and even subversions of tropes within the hero's journey. And then we had just George Lucas, who was, the brain behind it all. And it was all just his passion project, what he loved doing. And all of these things culminated together to form something that just took the world by storm, and nothing's been the same since.
Yep.
Awesome. Couldn't have said it better. Thank you guys so much for listening to our podcast. We are the Nerds by Nature, and we'll see you next time.
So may the force be with you.